Welcome back. Even as we await these decisions from the Supreme Court that could seriously alter laws and practices utilized for decades to address our nation's inequalities in history, there are two new signs this week that show we face an enduring and evolving racism. The Equal Opportunity Commission on Tuesday accused two major companies, car maker BMW and discount retailer Dollar General, of indirectly discriminating against African Americans by using criminal background checks to screen out workers. And also, this very same week, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, along with the Urban Institute, released an important new study that indicated overt racial discrimination against minority renters and home buyers persists as they face more subtle obstacles in their housing search. So, while the Supreme Court may be preparing to rule against practices like affirmative action, we are seeing that these are two seriously data-driven indications that racial discrimination of a new kind is thriving, so much so that obviously the government is looking at getting involved. And some people call it the new racism, or as author Rich Benjamin put it in his book, Searching for Whitopia, today racial segregation and division often result from habits, policies, and institutions that are not explicitly designed to discriminate. Contrary to popular belief, discrimination or segregation do not require animus. They thrive even in the absence of prejudice or ill will. It's common to have racism without racists. Joining our panel discussion is Rich Benjamin, who's also a senior fellow at Demos. Rich, thank you for being here. Let's talk about racism without racists, because these studies that we mentioned and a lot of what your book looked at was the idea that people don't need to be walking around with a racist target in their mind to be a part of a system that still leaves things incredibly unequal.
Yes, and in my learning and in my experience, that is what often confuses students like Abigail Fisher, is that they operate in their everyday life and race relations on an interpersonal level seem to be good, and they're not generally aware of the studies that you have pointed out that racial disparities still exist. And when I spoke to conservative whites around the country, they say, you know, well, we are not racist. And I say the point is to look at the structural issues, the practices that leave us with as much residential segregation and educational segregation as we had a generation ago. So
your book sort of looks at the question of where is the racism and says, for 2013, that may be the wrong question.
Exactly. We have to look at social engineering. We have to look at our transportation policies, our laws, our practices that socially engineer the society with the racist results that we have to say. And I just say that because with the affirmative action and with quote-unquote racial positive policies, we're told that's racial engineering. You can't change human nature. But all public policy is social engineering. The question is, what do you want to effect you want to have? And
Jelani, that goes to the point we were just discussing with Nick from a conservative view, which is saying, look, things have changed. People aren't being fire hosed, was some of the language he used. So the government shouldn't be in these decisions anymore.
Mm-hmm. And I think that the problem with that argument is it's like saying if crime decreases, then we no longer need to make murder illegal, or we no longer need to say that it's illegal to assault someone. The fact is that we have a kind of prophylactic effect with the laws, and the point is to be preventative.
I want to pause. That's so important. I mean, Kenji, that is such an important point, right? The idea that usually in public policy, if something is working and reducing the bad thing, we say this policy works, right? And let's continue it. And here in civil rights, we're being told this policy works, so make it go away.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So this progress narrative, I think, is hurting us both in the voting rights context and the affirmative action context, which is to say we've made so much progress that racism is over. And I think that what Rich is saying is so important here, because I think that many of the forms of racism that exist today don't exist at the level of I have conscious animus against a particular person. So I think that the cutting edge research that's being done now is really about structural racism, about unconscious bias, about things like that, rather than the person who's willing to come out in polite society and say, I am against a particular racial group.
Yeah, I just wanted to underscore what Kenji just said in terms of the unconscious bias, because it's absolutely correct to emphasize the structural problems, but I think many people are unaware of the fact that they harbor a bias, that it's like if you're in a place where people are smoking, you're inhaling the smoke. You may not be a smoker, but you're still inhaling the passive smoke. And so this to me, it's not just about structure, it's also about the way in which people individually don't see or claim that they don't see race because psychologically they're attuned not to admit that they see it. And so on these tests that you can take up on what they call implicit association tests, you can find out that it's much easier for you, if you are white, to associate other white people with good things and black people with guns and with knives. And it's not intentional.
It's weird, and you talk about that as well, Rich, the idea that people have been taught to just pretend they're not seeing what they're seeing. So I could say to you, God, look at your afro, like your big hair, like, let's talk about it. But I could never say, like, oh yeah, Rich is my black friend. And people are like, what you mean by black friend? Yeah. Which is a funny thing that actually is driving at least some people in less diverse areas, less so in New York City, but in a lot of parts of the country, to avoid talking about the things that we actually need more tools to expose. I want to get your thoughts on that when we come back, right after the break. Stay with us here on MHP. Welcome back. We've been waiting on the Supreme Court to make up their minds on some pretty big cases on the docket, and this could be maybe, possibly, potentially the week, starting Monday and again on Thursday, if they decide against the government assurance of voting rights or against marriage equality or against affirmative action. What then? What will be next for those of us who care about these issues? Going right back to Rich Benjamin, who we have at the table. If we see negative rulings on affirmative action and voting rights, which many people expect, especially when you look at Justice Alito replacing Justice O'Connor, who was a key vote on some of these prior decisions, what do people who want to advance civil rights do?
As we were talking about, it's going to become about social movements. Here's the bottom line, Ari. 2042 white people are due or scheduled to become a minority, and this is animating a lot of these decisions. So the question becomes, how will we manage that transformation? Does one have a reactionary, restrictionist vision of diversity, whereas diversity is a zero-sum game for white men? Or does one have an expansive view, like you or a Bill Gates, who sees this as an opportunity? And how we manage that, not just with the Supreme Court decisions, but with other policies and practices, will be critical to our well-being, economically and politically.
I think the question is not what will happen in the future. I think we can kind of see that where the general trend is. But I think what will happen in the future is the same thing that happened in the past. We've never seen just a straight linear projection of progress for African Americans. Every time there's been progress, there's been regression. After emancipation, there were the redemption governments that brought about lynching and so on. After the civil rights movement, we saw the regression that came in the 70s and 80s. If that happens again, people will simply have to go back to the strategies that have been sustaining since the end of slavery. And continue to press forward.
Kenji?
Yeah, I guess I'm a little bit more optimistic than you are, Ari. I think we're going to win marriage cases, right? And I think that we're going to lose in some way the two race cases, the Voting Rights Act case and the affirmative action case. So I think this is going to be a term about the promise and the limits of formal equality. And I think that needs to be messaged out to the country, which is to say, what does equality mean to you? Does equality just mean this kind of mathematical equal treatment of people? Or does equality mean lifting up people who have been historically subordinated? Do we have an anti-classification view of the Equal Protection Clause, or do we have an anti-subordination view of it?
And I would add that the action is in the reaction, which is an organizing term for saying that people are going to have to mobilize in order to direct attention to the fact that these problems continue despite the court or certain members of the court feeling that we've solved these problems a long time ago.
And Rich, a final word?
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see how it goes. But, Ari, you went to Michigan. You understand the benefits of this. And this is what I was talking about, an expansive, positive view of the future, or one that's reactionary and restrictionist, where people perceive resources to be limiting. Or can we expand resources? Can we appeal to our best values as Americans and say, this is an opportunity, the pie is infinite? And I know that might sound Pollyannish, but it really is animating different views of how people are viewing same-sex marriage, voting rights, and the affirmative action cases.
Well, I think it also goes to the pictures that are in people's heads, to Jelani's point, how we react to this and whether we see it as advancement because we're all in this together, or some of the arguments that, as I mentioned, President Obama's lawyers made, not just the gift argument that Lani's written so eloquently about, that the person sitting next to you in the classroom is there for your benefit, potentially for the white majority benefit, and soon to be, to your point, the white minority benefit, but also that the legitimacy of our society depends on the people who are empowered to make decisions, and that includes equal opportunity policy and clearly voting protection so that we're all making those decisions about power together. I want to thank you guys. It's been a really tremendous conversation. I wish we had more time. I suspect MHP may have many of you on again, as you have been on before. And next up, I want to talk about defending evil, what it really takes to fight for the rights of those on the wrong side of the law. You're going to want to hear what we have to say about that. And on this Father's Day, a special look at the challenges of being a dad in the inner city. More Nerdland at the top of the hour. Please stay with us.